Welcome to the Donald and Paula Smith Family Foundation monthly public policy debate. Thanks for coming. If you are joining us on television, we urge you to visit the website, which is thesmithfamilyfoundation.org. The audience here knows that very well by now. And join us in person next time. You can check out the website, and we have in advance what the topics are going to be. And we have a live audience, which you can be a part of next time. Our forum tonight, our question tonight, there couldn't be a more relevant or timely issue than what we have. The topic tonight is responding to anti-Americanism in the Arab world. Have we been effective since 9/11? And why so timely? Well, first, it's 5 years and 1 day since the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Of course, we're about 2 months away from the congressional midterm elections, in which analysts say dozens of seats and perhaps the control of the House and Senate may be up and may be decided based on Americans' opinions on this issue, on the issue of the war on terror and how we're doing. And just today, Syrian guards outside the U.S. Embassy in Damascus killed 3 attackers and apprehended a suspect after a car exploded near the walls of the American compound, according to the Syrian Information Ministry. And also today, in a country that's been described as a model of Islamic democracy in Turkey, 7 people killed, 14 wounded, in an explosion in the southeastern Turkish city of Diyarbakir. According to CNN, authorities are looking at the possibility it could have been a bomb left in a package. So our topic tonight really is the anti-Americanism philosophies in the Arab world. How many of them hate us? For those that do hate us, why? And is it reversible? One thing we pretty much all agree is that in 2 years we'll be electing a new American president, and on Inauguration Day, January 2009, when we have a new president, is there a possibility to change? Or how might Arab opinion about America change on that day? Or is it deeper than that? So we have a great panel for you. We have David Frum, who is resident fellow of the American Enterprise Institute. To his left, Leon Hadar, Cato Institute research fellow in foreign policy studies. And to his left, on the end of the table, Craig Charney, who's the president of Charney Research. I'll have more elaborate introductions as we bring up each gentleman, but let's begin with David Frum, and his introduction is as follows. Former special assistant to President Bush for economic speechwriting. Frum's last 2 books were New York Times bestsellers, The Right Man, The Surprise Presidency of George W. Bush, released in 2003, and An End to Evil, What's Next in the War on Terror. Frum is also contributing editor to National Review, writes a daily column for the magazine's online edition. He's worked for the Manhattan Institute, Forbes magazine, the Wall Street Journal, is a contributing editor to Morning Edition on National Public Radio, and he's now at work on a history of foreign policy decision-making in the George W. Bush administration. He holds bachelor's and master's degrees from Yale University and a JD from Harvard Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you David Frum.
Thank you all. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you to the Smith Family Foundation for organizing this important talk. Above all, thank you to all of you. This war on terror, this conflict that the United States has been aware of since 9/11, has forced Americans to think in new ways and to learn new things. It has jolted the country out of a lot of old habits and patterns. And what we are doing here tonight, what you are doing here tonight by attending is a demonstration of the commitment of Americans to understand the world, to think more broadly and more deeply, exactly the kind of response that is necessary in order to achieve greater security for the next generation of Americans. And I think that I'm sure this will be a controversial evening. I'm sure there will be a lot of disagreement, but it is precisely out of this process of disagreement that I think a lot of answers are going to come. Not tonight, maybe, but over the coming years. And so I thank you. I'd like to begin by telling a little anecdote. And it's a deliberately insignificant one because, frankly, if I were to go on with sort of ones that were even more to the point, they might be a little bit too horrible to hear. But let me just tell you one story. It is the story of a man we'll call Mr. A. It's reported by a London-based human rights organization. Mr. A was a young man, a very capable amateur athlete. He was an Algerian, and he lived in a middle-class suburb of Algiers. One day in 1992, on the eve of the Algerian Civil War, or at the inception of the Algerian Civil War, he was bicycling for exercise through his neighborhood. A car spotted him, a car in the neighborhood spotted him, and accelerated toward him and hit him at very high speed, knocking him off his bicycle. He fell, both his legs were shattered. Out of the car poured 4 men who began to scream at him that bicycling was unknown in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and therefore by bicycling he had committed an un-Islamic act. And they began to kick him. They kicked him on his shattered legs, and they continued to kick them, on his broken legs, and they continued to kick them until the legs were completely shattered. And he was treated in London, but never fully recovered the use of his legs, and certainly never was able to engage in athletic activities ever again. Now, he's alive, he wasn't tortured to death, but it's just a small sample of one of millions of stories that could be told throughout the Middle East. This is obviously a very angry part of the world. And there is a lot of anger there, and there's been a lot of anger there for a long time. And although I am here, I suppose I'm invited, I owe my invitation to my association with the Bush administration, and so although I suppose it's my job to come and say the United States has done a masterful job over the past 5 years, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to take a different kind of contrarian view. I think the United States has failed to deal with this problem at all, but it is a failure of understanding that I'm afraid that many of the worst critics of the Bush administration share even more deeply than the Bush administration itself. There has been spiraling violence and cruelty through the Middle East, through the Arab world beginning, and then spilling over, as was mentioned in the example of Turkey, into countries that are not part of the Arab world at all, into cultural zones, Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, each of them a very different cultural zone, but each of them increasingly influenced by the culture of the Arab Middle East, substituting, for example, Arabic forms of Islam that originate in the Arab world for the forms of Islam more native to that region, substituting modes of dress, ideologies, even habits of speech that I'm told by people who speak Urdu, which I certainly don't, that you can begin to hear people affecting, Urdu speakers affecting accents as if they were native Arab speakers. Certainly, I think many of us can, there's an example of this with Johnny Walker Lindh, the American Taliban, who returned from Afghanistan speaking English with an Arab accent. The cultural prestige of Arab culture has grown in recent years, and it has exerted an influence with these areas, each of which in turn has become more susceptible to the kind of political extremism that originates in the Arab Middle East. Now, Americans have a great deal of difficulty grappling with this problem because of faults or characteristics, we don't have to call them faults, but characteristics in the American character. As a nation, Americans are solipsistic. That Americans believe that America is the world, that they're not quite sure the rest of the world is there, and it is a result that they believe that everything that happens anywhere on the planet is a response to something that happens in America, because foreigners would never do anything unless an American first caused them to do it. And this is both condescending, but it also, I think, it is a point of view shared across the American spectrum, both by chauvinistic Americans who believe that the American way is also right, and also by a lot of guilt-ridden Americans who believe that any problem that occurs anywhere on planet Earth is ultimately traceable to something done right here in the good old US of A. The second American fault is that Americans are tremendously instrumental-minded people. That they believe that things, that when people do things, they do things for pragmatic reasons. So if you see anger, it must be a response to something in the external world, because that's the way it happens here. The idea of anger emerging from a cultural crisis or from a spiritual crisis is something that is, I think, difficult for Americans to absorb. Americans, of course, are also intensely materialistic. So if people are angry, it must be because of something America has done. It must be, as I said before, some practical reason external to themselves, and probably it's got something to do with some kind of material grievance, either economic or political, something like that. And finally, Americans are transactional. They believe that everything is susceptible to a bargain. So when someone is angry, that the proper way to deal with that person is to seek out these practical grievances that are no doubt motivating him, that are probably your own fault in some way, maybe unintended. Find out what his grievances are and to cut a deal. See if you can split the difference. Find out if there's some way that you can find what's bothering him and amend yourself so as to correct it. And these assumptions are so deeply embedded in the American discourse. And I have to say they had a great impact on the way the Bush administration approached, or certainly initially approached, the problem of the Middle East after 9/11. That a great effort was made to assure people in the Middle East of American goodwill. That, you think we're mad at you, let us assure you that we're not mad at you. There was a great effort made to try to identify especially material grievances, whether it was lack of economic development or lack of democratic forms of government, to identify these grievances and to see what America could do to address them. Some people, not so much inside the Bush administration, but in America's allies, particularly in Europe, particularly the Blair government, identified very concrete foreign policy differences. The territorial dispute, or the supposed territorial dispute between Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and said maybe there's some kind of compromise there. And these attitudes inform, even more than they have informed policymaking, they have certainly informed our reporting, and they have certainly informed our cultural discussion. The problem is, they're not true. They're not true. They don't work. And so what I would propose to you today is that when we think about Arab anger, the anger of the broader Arab-influenced Middle East, we have to begin by painfully realizing we are confronting a civilizational crisis, an indigenous civilizational crisis, born out of spiritual, not necessarily materialistic problems, and one in which we are the objects of the anger, but not necessarily the subjects of it. This is a story that touches every American, but it is not fundamentally an American story. Thank you.
Leon Hadar is with the Cato Institute. He's a research fellow in foreign policy studies, specializing in foreign policy, international trade, the Middle East, South and East Asia. Former UN bureau chief for the Jerusalem Post, currently the Washington correspondent for the Singapore Business Times. His analyses on global affairs have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy magazines. He's taught at American University, Mount Vernon College. He's a graduate of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He earned his master's degree from the Schools of Journalism and International Affairs and the Middle East Institute at Columbia University, and his PhD from American University. Leon Hadar.
Thank you. Again, I want to thank the Smith Family Foundation for inviting me to participate in this panel, and thanking all of you for attending it. Now, I'm in New York, and whenever I'm in New York, I lived there for several years, I think about Woody Allen. Woody Allen kind of represents, I think, the spirit of the city, the excitement, cultural energy, and so on. And I wasn't very surprised, actually, that immediately after 9/11, I was reading an interview in the New Yorker, Joe Klein did from Tehran, interviewed an Iranian, westernized Iranian who was basically in love with America, and they asked her what she felt when 9/11 happened. And this is what she said, I quote, "Do you want to know what I was really worried about? Woody Allen. I didn't want him to die. I wanted to know that he was all right. I love his films." Now, I'm here to tell you that basically since 9/11, America lost Ava from Tehran, and she lost that loving feeling for the United States. And I think we also lost the hearts and minds of many Iraqis, Turks, and others in the Middle East. And my guess is that Ava is still watching Woody Allen. It's possible that Osama bin Laden in his cave in New York, in Pakistan, is watching Annie Hall on his plasma television there. But it's not about Woody Allen, and it's not about the way we were, and it's not about, to quote President Bush, who we are. It's about the policy, stupid. It's about American foreign policy and American policy in the Middle East more specifically. Now, a lot of Americans, which goes back to all this idea of American exceptionalism, assume that when Americans punish, invade, and bomb other countries, well, we are something special. Our values are unique. our intentions are benign, and we are basically good people. So when we do those things, you know, we have to measure it based on different criteria. In the real world, nations do, in order to advance their policy, do punish other countries, they invade other countries, they bomb other countries, and guess what? The people in those countries tend to get angry at those who do that. This is basically why nations don't go to war quite extensively. It's usually the last resort, because this is one of the causes of war, the anger that we ignite in other countries. This is basically International Relation 101, and it applies to US policy. It applies to many other actors, including terrorist groups. Now, I think it's not to blame America first to argue that during the Cold War, the policies that the United States pursued in the Middle East were neither benign nor altruistic. The United States was allied with a lot of despots in the Middle East, with military dictators. We deposed the democratically elected government in Iran. We were allied for a while with Saddam Hussein. Now, we did that because, based on the calculation of national interest, and I share that view, the United States should have been involved in the Middle East, and we should have expected that, you know, we were to pay that cost that took form of a lot of anti-Americanism, including American-held hostage in Tehran, terrorism, oil embargoes, and so on and so forth. Now, the argument I make in my book, Sandstorm, Policy Failure in the Middle East, is that when the Cold War ended, the United States should have reassessed its policy in the Middle East. Now, this didn't happen as a result mostly of the emergence of a unipolar system because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fact that there was no anymore any checks and balances on the global power, the United States. The US policy in the Middle East was aimed, since President Bush the one, at achieving US hegemony in the region. Now, this has been a policy since the first Gulf War to the last Gulf War, through the first Bush administration and Clinton. Under the first Bush and Clinton, this was done for what I call cost-free Pax Americana. There was a dual containment of Iran and Iraq. There was an attempt to revive the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, at least to demonstrate that we are doing something. But all of that resulted eventually in some anti-Americanism. And I think in some respect, the Second Intifada and 9/11 should be seen in that context. If you want to be a hegemon, you have to pay for it. And part of the cost are indeed anti-Americanism, terrorism, and so on and so forth. Now, since 9/11, the US hegemonic project in the Middle East looks more and more like the British imperial project in the region. And you can say about imperial project in the region what Oscar Wilde once said about a second marriage, which is a triumph of hope over experience. But the fact of the matter is that it's very similar. In the old movies, we saw the British creating Iraq, establishing ties with the Hashemites and the Saudis, helping to maintain order in Egypt, trying to prevent this or that cycle of violence between Arab and Jews in the Middle East. Now, we know how that movie ended, and what we have now is basically, you can call it the American unilateral moment in the Middle East film. It's a different actors, but it's very similar script, recreating Iraq, maintaining ties with the Saudis and the Hashemites, trying to prevent violence in the Holy Land. And this hegemonic project, like that of its predecessor, is igniting nationalism. It's igniting anti-American, anti-hegemonic sentiments that take form of nationalism, ethnicity, religious identities, and so on and so forth. Now, when you look at the script, I think you can make an argument that what the neoconservative ideologue did is add Wilsonian soundtrack to the old hegemonic movie, if you will, we can both achieve hegemony in the Middle East, and also we can make the region safe for democracy. As I said at one point, it is as though we had this unnatural union between President Woodrow Wilson, who wanted to make the world safe for democracy, and Queen Victoria, the imperialist. You know, we have this very ugly creature that emerged of this union, and it's basically the democratic empire in the Middle East. And what we did in the Middle East is really not make it safe for democracy. We made it safe for nationalism. And nationalism, we have to remember, is a much more powerful force than democracy. And as a result, the anti-hegemonic, the nationalist sentiments in the Middle East are directed against the United States. So we are trying to do these things. On one hand, we are trying to impose hegemony directly in Iraq, indirectly in Lebanon, through proxies in Palestine. And at the same time, we are promoting democracy and election, which result in the emergence of the Shiite radicals, pro-Iranian government in Iraq, in the election of the Hamas party in Palestine, and also in the rise of the Hezbollah, or the strengthening of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we think, you know, we create the conditions in which this anti-Americanism takes place, and we also encourage it. And we think that if we afterwards, almost like a parrot on crack, go around the Middle East and say, you know, freedom is on the march, freedom is on the march, people are going to fall in love with us, and that is not the case. And, I'll be delighted to continue the discussion later.
All right. Last but not least, Craig Charney, president of Charney Research. Before founding this firm, he was senior analyst on the polling teams of President Bill Clinton. Widely published political scientist and commentator, he has published more than a dozen articles in scholarly journals and a book based on his polling and research work, as well as pieces in the New York Times, other leading newspapers. Of particular interest to tonight's session, and if you get a chance to read this online, you should. I did before coming here tonight. Mr. Charney wrote a paper, A New Beginning, Strategies for a More Fruitful Dialogue with the Muslim World for the Council on Foreign Relations. Just over a year ago, he went to Morocco and Indonesia and Egypt and asked Arabs what they thought of the U.S. Craig Charney, everyone.
Thank you. Picture this, if you will. 8 angry Egyptian men in a focus group room. You're behind the glass, the one-way mirror, watching them. And they've been venting rage at all things American for an hour. Then one of them, a graying 60-year-old with a little pencil mustache, sighs and says, you know, I used to love America. I wish it would get back to what it was. And his words underlined really what I found out in the focus groups that you were just speaking about. We did research in those 3 countries. We've also done research in Lebanon, Afghanistan, Jordan, Egypt, and some other places. What we found was that we can't simply assume that things are immutable, that things are fixed in the Arab world. It's a very dynamic situation, and while what we do is not the only shaper of it, what we do certainly is a factor in what's going on. Now, something that I saw that was very interesting was that in all 3 countries where we did the research, Egypt, Morocco, and Indonesia, people said things were getting better because of political and economic reform. Things were opening up, they had greater freedoms. In Indonesia, at least, they had elected leaders. And they recognized the fact that their lives were changing in a positive way. In many ways, this may come as a surprise to people who've heard that everything is supposedly constantly getting worse in the Muslim world. And our research was also confirmed by the findings of Andy Kohut and the Pew Research team, which also found that in Egypt and Morocco, a majority of people said that by 2005, 2006, things were headed in the right direction in their countries. Here's the bad news, though. Even though things were getting better, they were liking us less. In other words, hostility to America was increasing despite the fact that they liked their own rulers a little better. Now, what this suggests is, in fact, that the hostility towards America, whatever its origins may be, do not lie in deflected hostility towards the rulers of Arab states, nor does it necessarily lie in a profound and unchanging civilizational crisis in these countries. We can't let ourselves off the hook that easily. Rather, we have to understand the dynamics that are going on, what's actually happening in these countries, and the way we are part of those dynamics. In particular, the position that my research led me to is somewhat different from the position either of David or Leon. Some people say that we are hated for who we are and that they are different. Some people say we're hated for what we do. My view is that we are hated for what we are perceived to be doing. Perceptions matter. And the way perceptions are shaped is a mixture of reality, of portrayal, and of omission. One part of the anger at us, frankly, is based on reality. It's things that we have done. We did invade Iraq. Many people died. The torture at Abu Ghraib were real. And one of the things that we found in the groups was that one of the things that hurts us the most is when people see us to be betraying the very ideals that we espouse. These are things that are noticed, and they make people angry. Likewise, more recently, just to judge by what I've seen from more recent material, in Lebanon and elsewhere, people noticed the fact that we held back, or at least did not push for, the most rapid possible truce during the recent war between Israel and Hezbollah. This too is noticed. This too makes a difference. As someone said to me, if you consider that the poster boys for American democracy policy in the Middle East have been Lebanon and Iraq, would you like to be living in either of those countries right now? However, it's not just what we've done, it's also what's said about it. When we asked people what their major sources of information were about the US, they were quite open. Satellite TV, in particular, the dreaded Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera does not go out of its way to be nice to us, to put it mildly. When we did a content analysis of their website, for instance, we found almost unremitting hostility to the United States. So our actions are often portrayed in the most negative possible light. Now, there are a variety of reasons for this, which I can speak about in more detail in the Q&A. But what's quite clear is that how we're portrayed is also part of the problem. A third thing we found, though, also was that what people didn't know about us. For example, in Egypt, when we asked about major U.S. aid programs, because Egypt is the largest recipient of U.S. development aid worldwide, when we asked people how much they thought their country had gotten in the last few years, they told us, a few $1 million. When we said that it had been over $7 billion, they nearly fell out of their chairs. They said, where did it go? Now, it's not a bad question. But we also asked them about some of the places where we knew it had gone, the health clinics, which they thought were paid for by Mrs. Sadat, the non-polluting buses, which they thought had been a gift of someone else. They did know, however, that the Japanese had provided the opera house. But they didn't know that we had moved the largest single source of pollution in Cairo, a huge lead smelter, well out of the city and well beyond the city limits. And anyone who's ever been to Cairo knows how bad the air is. Now, what this points to is a third problem, which is the spectacular failure of American public diplomacy. Now, this began a few years ago, and I was working for Clinton when this happened, when Jesse Helms said, you're either going to close USAID or you're going to close the U.S. Information Agency. And choosing the lesser evil, the U.S. Information Agency was closed. I would call that unilateral disarmament in the war of ideas. This was followed under the current administration by many people who, at the time we were going into Iraq or the run-up to it, simply said, it does not matter if we are loved as long as we are feared. And the attitude of many in the administration was that public diplomacy didn't matter. And the third thing has been our own public diplomacy efforts. There have been a succession of failures. Charlotte Beers, shortly after 9/11, showing irrelevant spots in Muslim countries about how nicely Muslims were treated in the United States, when that was very far from their concerns. Margaret Tutwiler, who, though a spectacularly good professional, was hired and finally decided in the midst of the run-up, either in the run-up or the midst of the aftermath of the Iraq War, that she'd been handed Mission Impossible and decamped to the New York Stock Exchange. And finally, that post ended up being vacant for a year or so. I guess it was so radioactive, nobody would touch it. And then finally, the current incumbent, Karen Hughes, who has been doing the best possible job with scant resources and in an extremely difficult situation. She has at least made an effort to listen, an effort to try to coordinate the message, an effort to try to inject public diplomacy and considerations of the impact on the perception of the U.S. into the State Department's policymaking process. All things which Hughes herself has noted did not exist prior to her tenure. And only someone who had the ear of the president, and I say this as a Democrat, by the way, only someone who had the ear of this president could have begun to force through these things. She's been moving things in the right direction, but she's starting from a very low base. What I'd leave you with, though, is a thought that all is not hopeless, that things can be changed and things can be made different. And it came from another one of those focus groups in Egypt. This was one which had a group of young women speaking, all wearing headscarves. And there was one of them who was talking about how America was like this guy she dated, actually. She said, America is like this great guy who you think is terrific, and then he keeps doing stupid, immature things, and then you start to hate him. She was mad when she said it, but the interesting thing is she was smiling too. Thank you.
All right, this is the rebuttal section. I guess we'll come back up to the podium for that. David Frum, 4 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I hope you noticed that the two people who followed me committed every single error that I warned against. And I would challenge them later on just to consider a less solipsistic, less materialistic, and less transactional point of view. And I would invite you to, that I think that President Bush is wrong when he says that the United States is hated for who we are. I think the critics of the president are wrong when they say the United States is hated for who we do, for what we do. I think it is wrong to say we are hated for what we are perceived to do, because those perceptions exist because of pre-existing attitudes that allow the filtering of information. People hear what they are disposed to hear, and people do not hear what they are not disposed to hear. I would say the United States is hated not for who we are, not for what we do, but for who they are. And this story is a story about the Middle East. And that is why when you look at the victims of Arab and Islamic terrorism, and you count them, they are, above all, Arabs and Muslims. That we need a theory of Arab anger that explains the Algerian civil war that left 100,000 people dead in the most horrific possible way. If it's true that it is American bombs and American invasions that cause anti-Americanism, we need a theory that explains why, again, according to those Pew surveys that Craig cited, the most anti-American country in the greater Islamic world is Pakistan, a country that the United States has, I would say unwisely, but has aligned itself with almost consistently since the creation of the Pakistani state, and which the United States backed in Pakistan's most desperate war in 1971, and which has never been on the receiving end of anything except American aid and support. We need a theory. We need a theory that explains why it is that the United States can lavish so much aid on Egypt and other Arab countries, and they will not take note of it. And we need a theory that says that explains why it is that all of the different approaches of advertising and self-promotion that the United States has done have had the same negative effect. One more thing. It is very striking. It's very striking when you look at the Arab and Islamic Middle East that this theory that people become angry at policies just it applies only selectively to certain countries. It is remarkable, for example, when you look at surveys of Arab and Islamic attitudes, how little opposition you see to how little dislike you see, for example, of Russia, which is a country that actually did invade Afghanistan and that had a major occupying presence in Egypt for most of the early part of the Egyptian state, or the post-British Egyptian state. That you see a complete oblivion of massacres and atrocities inflicted by one country in the region upon another in a way that is really kind of startling. So campaigns like the Egyptian invasion of Yemen in the 1960s, which is the first time, by the way, that poison gas was used as a weapon of war in the Middle East, completely forgotten into the memory hole. I think when you try to understand how the Arab world reacts to the United States, you need to ask a more sophisticated question, which is why does this stimulus produce this response when exactly other or more severe stimuluses of the same kind do not? And I think, again, we have to begin with a little bit more humility to say, this is their story. We need to understand the Algerian Civil War. We need to understand the Lebanese Civil War. These are expressions of the same anger. This is an expression of the same crisis. I'm not saying the crisis is immutable. In fact, I think almost by definition, a crisis is not immutable, but it is here, it is now, and it reaches out, and it is present, not just in the Middle East, it is present in London. I think it's present on Ocean Avenue, too. Thank you. Atlantic Avenue, I mean to say.
Leon, you've been put on notice that you made all of the mistakes David warned you against making, so here's your opportunity to defend yourself.
By the way, apropos the Soviet Union and Russia, I mean, the fact of the matter is that I think a lot of people in the Middle East and in the Muslim world remember what the Russians did in Afghanistan. And if anything, one of those who remember that was Osama bin Laden, who was one of our allies there in the war against the Soviet in Afghanistan. That was a very unpopular war. I think there's a lot of left a horrible legacy as far as the Russians are concerned, and we exploited that very successfully, and hooray for that. So, you know, it's not true that the Russians are, you know, being treated with a lot of sympathy in the Muslim world. Now, the fact of the matter is that go beyond, I think it's interesting to look at one country in the Middle East, which is Turkey. Turkey was one of the most pro-American countries in the Middle East, both in terms of its population and its political elite. It's now one of the most anti-American countries in the Middle East, certainly in terms of public opinion. Mein Kampf was in the bestseller list for a few weeks there. One of the most popular books is a book in which a Turkish agent is fighting against the Americans, and I think there was a movie recently that also with an anti-American theme that was very popular there. And I think the change that took place in Turkey had to do with policies. I mean, you cannot explain the tremendous change that took place in that country after the invasion of Iraq only by policy. There is nothing else to explain it. It has nothing to do, Turkey was never close to the Arab world, and as I said, there was a very strong pro-American tradition there. Now, as far as the issue of public relations that was raised here, I studied public relations. I worked in, you know, I did my PhD on international communication and the role of the American media in the Middle East. But I tend to be very skeptical about the notion that if we add just a great public relation firm, we can really change the image of the United States in the Middle East. One of the first things that you learn in public relation is that you cannot sell ice to Eskimos, for example. So if the policy doesn't work, it's very difficult to sell it to people. And I think that as far as the Middle East is concerned, that is the problem that we are facing now as far as policy. And I don't think any changes in the management of public relations is going to change that. Moreover, I think a lot of people in the Middle East and around the world tend to sometimes separate between their attitude towards the United States. If you go to in the 1990s, and even now I assume, to most places in the world, people will talk about Michael Jordan and CNN and Microsoft. There's a lot of sympathy and support for the United States. But at the same time, there is opposition to policies. And, there's no contradiction. The Sandinistas, when they were fighting against the United States, were opposed to U.S. policy, rightly or wrongly. They were also great. They were watching the baseball games from the United States every Sunday. I mean, they were a great fan of baseball, as Castro was. At one point, he almost joined the baseball league in this country. Hitler used to enjoy watching American films, as did Stalin. So, I think a lot of people can separate between their attitude toward the United States, which I think remains very sympathetic, and the attitude towards policy. And I think the main problem that we're facing now is policy.
Greg Charney.
In a bold rhetorical move, after presenting a position which was thoroughly solipsistic and narcissistic, David proclaimed that that Leon and I had done the same. In fact, though, the problem is this. We cannot we can hardly say there is no evidence of change, or we can hardly say they have a problem, we do not. That is essentially a narcissistic position. In particular, to say, well, there's a profound civilizational crisis makes it extremely hard to understand why the people who are constantly experiencing this civilizational crisis one day are opposed to us, another day may like us. Or rather, one day like us, the next day are opposed to us, even though the civilizational crisis is getting better. More to the point, we also cannot understand that if we actually listen to the people. And one of the things that was very strikingly absent, aside from one or two anecdotes, was actual evidence in the presentation that David was making. What I heard repeatedly in the countries we were talking about was not that we were losing people because they hated America, because they felt that they were in a profound crisis, because they were so subjected to their own woes and neuroses that they really wanted to have nothing to do with us or wished us ill. The real problem in the Arab world is that we are losing the very people who are sympathetic to the reforms that we are espousing. The focus groups that we conducted specifically were conducted in urban areas among the middle-class elites. These were people who wanted the very things that the Bush administration and other Americans want, namely free elections, free speech, the rule of law, free markets. What's more, they were pretty hostile to extremists. For example, when we asked about Iran, and asked them to free associate, what we heard was veil, extremism, rage, violence, or when they commented at greater length, a rich country which cannot get rich because it has bad government. Those don't sound like people who are so captive of their own neuroses that they simply hate America as a sort of reflexive response. On the other hand, it is the result of people who respond to the world as they perceive it, as they see it, what they know about it. I think Leon is partly right. Partly what we have done in our policies are part of the problem. As well, however, there's another piece as well, and that is how those policies are described and also what people do not know about what we are doing. Now, something that was very interesting is the case of Pakistan, not an Arab country, admittedly, but an interesting one. Because there, after there was a substantial U.S. earthquake relief effort, we found that the image of America improved substantially. Similarly, the American relief effort after the tsunami in Indonesia led to a significant impact on opinion both there and, interestingly enough, in Morocco as well. When people hear about things that we're doing, it really can make a difference if we're doing the right thing. But we have had a very small megaphone. To give you an example, even now, after Karen Hughes has gotten the public diplomacy budget up significantly, we spend less to tout the world image of the United States than Coke spends to promote its products worldwide. Just one country. We spend about $200 million. All things considered, it seems to me that there is no simple explanation for this. We can't just say, oh, they hate us because of who we are, or rather, the converse of that, because of the defects in what they are. We can't just say it's all the bad things that we do or all the things that we have done, because ultimately it is the perceptions that people have of what we have done that shapes that. And those perceptions are shaped partly by the realities, but also by the description and by the presentation of them, and above all, by the omissions of what we do as well. Thanks.
All right, I guess these mics are on now. So maybe guys pull the mics a little closer when you speak. And I'm just going to do some quick questions just down the row, and then we'll get into some longer responses. But just a couple ideas that occurred to me. Your best guess, yes or no, is bin Laden alive? David?
You know, I do a lot of television punditry, and one of the ways I think I keep myself at least semi-sane during it is by trying not to issue opinions on things I don't know anything about. So I have no idea.
50-50 to you, right down the middle.
No, it's just an uncertainty to me. I don't know.
Okay, Leon?
I assume that he is alive, and I think one of the, we mentioned we were in the green room, I mentioned that I think one of the fiascos of this administration is the failure to capture Osama bin Laden. And I think if you use the World War II analogies, as though Hitler and Himmler would be fleeing Berlin and hiding in a cave in, say, in Spain under Franco, I'm sure that, Truman, whoever was in power at that time, would have done everything in their power to capture him. And I think
We're moving down the road fast. Craig?
Yeah.
Craig, yes or no on bin Laden?
My polling didn't tell me that. What I did find out, though, was that he is a rock star, or was a rock star in much of the Muslim world, at least by 2003, early 2004. Interestingly enough, though, we also found that his star dimmed a great deal after the terrorist attacks in Casablanca, in Bali, and other places, where he became a whole lot less popular.
Okay, let's go back the other way. The next question is Iran's claim that it wants to pursue nuclear power for electricity sitting on gigantic oil reserves, is that credible?
Again, that's not a question a pollster can answer.
Okay, well, all right. Leon?
Well, there's no doubt that Iran wants to acquire nuclear military power, and it will probably acquire nuclear power in the long run. It's a mid-sized power that perceives its interest in terms of its regional interests, a relationship with the United States, with Israel, and so on. We can probably slow that process to some extent.
So that's a yes, though?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
But
despite the oil reserves. Okay, go ahead.
It does that one. I do know something on that. It doesn't pass the laugh test. In the last round of talks between the three European countries, Britain, France, and Germany, and Iran, that were spearheading it, the last offer they put on the table was, okay, we'll give you a nuclear reactor, free, but we want control of the fuel. And the Iranians said no to that. And people who are technical experts on the program say the things they are doing are just not consistent with a peaceful program. They are absolutely weapons-driven. And that's also why they're buying so many rockets.
Okay, so let me ask you this. The day that Tehran announces they have a working nuclear weapon, what changes? Does Israel attack? Does Iran attack Israel? Is there a mutually assured destruction scenario that actually makes things safer? What do you think?
What changes is it becomes much harder for the United States to deter Iranian terrorism against American targets. You'll recall that in 1995 and 1996, the Iranians inflicted a lot of terrorism on American targets, especially in Saudi Arabia. The Khobar Towers, there were other incidents as well. The United States, the Clinton administration, found itself on the brink of war with Iran that culminated with the issuance of an American ultimatum to Iran. It's the Clinton administration. You kill any more American soldiers, and next time we'll really do something about it. But they found that ultimatum credible. The day after Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, that kind of ultimatum will no longer be credible, and I think you can expect then to see a much more assertive and aggressive Iranian foreign policy, both in the Gulf and in the broader Middle East.
So they're not likely to use the weapon, but a more assertive foreign policy.
Yes, and greater resort to terrorism and greater bullying of their neighbors and greater interference in the Gulf, the same way that they did in the 1980s when they fired at all those Kuwaiti tankers.
Let's go to Leon. Leon, what will Israel do if Iran is on the brink of the bomb?
I think what you said about mutual assured destruction, that's probably the right model that we can expect. As a matter of fact, we have that in South Asia between the Hindus and the Pakistani Muslims who are probably in terms of the relationship with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, it was much more stronger than the one that Iran had. But the fact of the matter is that I think in the long run, the Iranian drive for nuclear military power started under the Shah. It's supported by most Iranians, including secular Iranians. And it's going to happen. I think Israel is going to, you're going to have some kind of a mutual assured destruction system in the Middle East. It works, it seems to be working quite well in South Asia, where we didn't have either a nuclear or a conventional war since the two countries acquire a nuclear weapon, and I think it can work in the Middle East.
Okay, I'm going to give you a different question because I'm guessing you're going to say a pollster is not going to answer the last question.
Yes, I have opinions on this subject, but they're not professional ones.
Okay. Well, then, Craig, I'm going to ask you about an op-ed piece you wrote that appeared in June in the Boston Globe about improved American PR to the Muslim world, citing encouraging initiatives like the tsunami relief for Indonesia, like Business for Diplomatic Action, which is a corporate consortium. But I want to ask about your disclaimer in that piece. You write, a new American approach to communicating with Muslims faces obstacles. One cause of Muslim outrage is the gap between America's democratic rhetoric and the reality of Washington's support for authoritarian leaders in the Islamic world. How do we get around that? Do we stop supporting those leaders? And if so, then what would happen?
Well, it's a very real dilemma, and it's the dilemma that's facing American foreign policy and democracy policy terms at this point. One of the ways out of that dilemma that my co-author, Stephen Cook, has suggested, is the notion of a pacted transition. For example, as was done in some cases in Latin America and in Southern Europe, where there are certain negotiations and certain guarantees so that authoritarian rulers and the groups associated with them don't necessarily lose all when they go through a democratic transition. The truth is, though, this is a difficult set of choices. However, the fact remains that if we remain wedded to these authoritarian rulers, we are probably not purchasing ourselves stability, we're probably purchasing ourselves greater instability in the end.
There is a new president of a group called the Islamic Society of North America. It's Dr. Mattson, grew up in Canada, PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago, now lives in Connecticut. That may not surprise you. What may surprise you, it is Dr. Ingrid Mattson, the first woman president in the group's 43 years of existence. But that's in North America. In Saudi Arabia, women comprise 5% of the workforce, even though they get half of the college degrees. They cannot drive a car. They need permission from a man to go to school, to get a job, to travel, or even to stay in a hotel. They need a man's permission, every woman. So my question is to whoever wants to jump in, what do mainstream Muslim women in some of these countries think? Do they view female driving as a decadence, or could women's rights be the Trojan horse through which Western sensibilities take root?
When Karen Hughes went to Saudi Arabia, actually, she spoke to a group of women and said, well, shouldn't you be allowed to drive? And they said, we don't really care, we have our drivers. And they mentioned that in the Washington Post article. What the Washington Post article omitted was then she said, and I think shouldn't you also have the right to vote? They started cheering. So yes, I think the answer is women are clearly and women's rights are one of the key fault lines that relate to this. And women are one of the groups who represent potential key allies for the United States and for people who are trying to promote liberalization and democratization in Muslim societies.
Gentlemen?
Yeah, I want to make clear, and I hope people understood that because I couldn't finish my first presentation, is that I'm a realpolitik guy. My main interest is to what extent U.S. policy advances American national interest. Now, I do think that to some extent Americans, including in government, certainly private groups, should try to promote different agendas around the world, including democracy and liberalization. I don't think it should be the central focal point of American foreign policy. And in that context, I think it doesn't make sense, as I suggested, and I don't understand your argument. I mean, the fact of the matter is tomorrow there's going to be election in Egypt. The radical Muslim Brotherhood are going to win the election, as Hamas won in the West Bank. So it's not clear to me how we are going to deal with that issue. I mean, it's clear to me that the process of democracy or free election, as people talk about it here, is going to lead to more radicalization, the rise of nationalism and so on and so forth. Let me just finish that. At one point, the women's right, I always mention that, and people are really surprised. Do you know when Switzerland allowed women to vote? Do you know the year in which Switzerland, the great democracy, allowed women to vote? Which? I'm sorry?
71, 72?
71.
71.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, that's
Exactly
good.
my
Let's
point.
move on. Actually, another point. Actually, David, I want to ask something about a column I read from the National Post, the Canadian National Post, and I want to make sure I read this right, that you said in a major survey conducted this summer, 2/3 of British Muslims said they wish to see legal punishments for those who in any way insulted Islam.
Right. About 68%.
British Muslims.
Yes, 68%. In any way, there was a much higher number, 78%, who thought there should be legal punishments for defamation of the Prophet Muhammad. So there's sort of a light, casual insult to Islam, 2/3, but something more serious, 4/5.
Okay.
Can I?
All right, go. You want to answer the woman thing?
Let me take on the woman, because I'm concerned about American national interests too. And I think one of the things that is sort of embedded in this discussion, and I think maybe before we open it up to general questions, is that fascinating word policies in the question. What most of us, because of those materialistic transactions, all those things I diagnosed at the beginning, when we hear policies, what we think of are political and economic policies. We think of the American support for the State of Israel. We think perhaps of the American involvement with the Saudi royal family or the Egyptians. From the point of view of, though, many of the people who are trying to kill us, MTV is every bit as much an American policy as support for the state of Israel. What they see, and it's not just because that this is something about us, this is something because of TV, it comes into their lives. And it creates a constant challenge to traditional authority structures in their own societies. Naguib Mahfouz, the great Egyptian novelist who just died this past month, his novels are full of of the power of paternal authority as the fundamental constitutive fact of the Arab family and therefore the Arab world. The great American student, the great student of America, one last sentence, Alex Tocqueville observed that the power of slavery, of the habit of slavery over the mind of the master is to make the master irritable and quick to take offense. And I think you can often look at the family structures that somebody like Mahfouz describes, and you can see how this would make the people who are at the top of the system, the men, very ready to be angry at any challenge to their authority. And that is one of the policies that we should have in mind, that we have to ask
David, when were
ourselves,
those
are we
books
prepared to
published?
change? What?
When were those books published, David?
They begin in the 1940s and they continue until he died last week. And
The books didn't continue till he died last week. In particular, the novels that he's most famous for deal with Egypt in the 1950s. What's quite interesting is there's been a new and more controversial controversial publication called the Yacubian Building, which is a building which has all kinds of residents, young, old, liberal, conservative, gay, straight, and which is the subject of a very controversial movie in Egypt nowadays, in fact. One where there have been calls for banning, there's been calls for editing, but calls which have not been taken up. The sorts of changes you're talking about are, in fact, important changes that are happening in the society. One of the interesting things precisely is that the Egypt that people are living in today is not the Egypt of Naguib Mahfouz era. It is the Egypt of the Yacubian Building. And it is a very dynamic society and one in which changes are occurring.
That's the Egypt of people who speak English and have credit cards.
No, on the contrary, that's the Egypt in which people make movies which circulate throughout the Arab world in Egyptian Arabic, such as the film of the Yacubian Building, which is enormously popular in Egypt.
I would like you guys to please thank our panel. David Frum is with the Resident Fellow, American Enterprise Institute. Leanne Hadar, Cato Institute. Craig Charney, President of Charney Research. Thank you for watching the program of the Smith Family Foundation. Again, the website, thesmithfamilyfoundation.org. And we'll see you next time. I'm Bob Bowdon.